Thank you. Welcome to the New Yorker Festival. I'm glad you could all come this afternoon. If I'm counting correctly, I think this is my 8th consecutive talk at the New Yorker Festival, which means that if this festival had term limits, I would be finished. That's an observation you can file under how the world would be different if the Tea Party took over. This is a historic speech for a number of reasons. One is it's the first time that I've ever given a talk at the festival where my parents were not in attendance. So that means that the number of enthusiastic responses I'm going to get is at least two less than normal. My mother told me, though, that if she were here, she would almost certainly like what I had to say. But that's sort of cold comfort, because she's substituting the illusion of empirical enthusiasm for the dull certainty of a priori enthusiasm. I don't know if that made any sense, but this is also historic for another reason, and that is that in all of my time giving talks at the New Yorker Festival, I've always given a title and never talked about what the title was. Because you never know when you're asked to give the title. It's months before the festival. Who knows what you want to talk about? But this is the first time I've ever had a talk that's actually what the title said the talk was going to be. So this is very exciting for me that finally there is truth in advertising. I want to talk about the magical year 1975. Now, what was magical about 1975? Well, there's a long answer and there's a short answer. The long answer is that if you look at the transformation of American society that has happened in the last generation or so, which is that we have gone from a country that was among the most economically equal countries in the world to a country that is now far and away not only more economically unequal than at any point in its history, including the Gilded Age, but also more economically unequal than almost any other westernized country. So that's the long answer, is that this extraordinary transformation in the nature and shape of our society begins on or about 1975. The short answer as to why 1975 is a special year is connected to the long answer, and is simply, it is the year that talent started to get paid. And I'm going to address chiefly the short answer as a way of answering the long answer. And I got interested in this question of the magic year 1975 because last summer I went to visit a man named Marvin Miller. Now, some of you will remember who Marvin Miller is. He is the man who took over the Major League Baseball Players Union in 1966. And he led the union for the next 20 years or so. And for that period, he was arguably the most visible and well-known and most powerful union leader in the country. But I want to go one step further this afternoon, as I want to argue that in the course of leading the Baseball Players Union, Marvin Miller leads a transformation of our economy in ways both good and bad. Now, Miller is still very much alive. He's in his 90s. He lives in one of those plain vanilla high-rises on the Upper East Side. And he's 100% sharp. And he's this little kind of wiry guy, just as he was back in the day. Remember, there would always be pictures of him, at press conferences. And Marvin Miller would be here, and then the players behind him would be, 1.5 heads taller than him. And he still has his little Fu Manchu mustache. And he grew up in Brooklyn. He's a real New Yorker. He's got that New Yorker, that Brooklyn honk in his voice to this day. And there's two things that are important to know about Marvin Miller. The first is that he is a union man, and I use that phrase in the sense that it has been used historically in this country. He is a kind of person who rarely exists anymore. Someone who grew up steeped in the rituals and ways and traditions of the trade union movement. During the war, he worked for the War Labor Board. He worked for one of the municipal unions after that here in New York. And then he spends the bulk of his career, long before he gets to baseball, He is the chief economist for the United Steelworkers. He's one of the most powerful figures at one of the most powerful unions in the world. Steelworkers at their height had about 1.5 million members and really control one of America's most important industries. And he is in the room in all of the crucial steel negotiations of the 50s and early 60s, including the steel strike in 1962 or 3 or 4, when right at the beginning of the Vietnam War, the steelworkers threatened to shut down the American steel industry, and the dispute is negotiated in a room at the White House with Lyndon Johnson, who literally locks them in the room and says, "I'll unlock the door when you've solved this particular problem." So he is this crucially important union figure, and it even goes back to his early days. He one of the most formative experiences of his childhood is as a small boy, at the beginning of the Depression. He remembers he would take the subway in from Brooklyn and go and visit his father, who sold ladies' coats on Division Street at a department store. And one day, he's just a little kid, and he gets off the subway, and he sees this commotion ahead. And he walks closer, and he realizes that it's a picket line. And his father is walking the picket line. They're attempting to organize the workers at this particular department store. It's the Retail Wholesale Department Store Employees Union. And there's a long, ugly strike at the beginning of the Depression. His father's out of work for about 2 months. And he remembers one day being asleep one night and being woken up by his father, who'd come home late. And his father had in his hands a copy of the contract that they had finally won from the department store. And to this day, that was 80 years ago, Miller can recite from memory in perfect detail every one of the provisions his father won that day. Right? That's a union man. Right? It's the most important experience of his childhood. So he understands the meaning of class solidarity and class struggle. The second thing you need to know about Miller is that he is tough as nails. He is just about the most formidable adversary that you could ever imagine. I mean, he's well into his 90s now, and he's quite physically frail. But if I was having a dispute with anyone in my life, ranging from my landlord to, the head of some sovereign nation, he literally would be the first person I would call. He's the kind of person who you want in your foxhole, and who will represent your interests as aggressively and intelligently as is possible. He is not the kind of person you would ever want to cross. His chief adversary when he's head of the baseball union is the commissioner of baseball in those years, who was a man named Bowie Kuhn. And Bowie Kuhn represented the kind of effete East Coast Ivy League, bow-tied, weak-willed, whiskey-sipping, polo-playing person that Marvin Miller truly loathed. And Miller thought that Kuhn was a moron, I think justifiably. And they have a famous exchange where Kuhn, who wanted to be friends with Miller, accused Miller of failing to reciprocate his overtures of friendship. And Miller responds that he doesn't think that Kuhn actually wants to be friends. He said Kuhn was trying to pick my brains, and there was scant possibility of reciprocity in that department. So I go and see Miller just this summer, a couple of months ago. And he tells me the following story. It's 1966, and he's taken over the Baseball Players Union, and it's a mess. It wasn't actually a union in the sense that we understand a union, or in the sense that Miller understood a union. It was a company union. It was a kind of something the owners sort of set up on behalf of the players, which, by the way, as Miller would repeatedly point out, was illegal, contravened all kinds of labor law in this country. Nonetheless, it was this little kind of wholly owned subsidiary of the owners, and they basically told the players what to do, and they made them sign these outrageous contracts, and there was no grievance procedures. They could basically do what they wanted to do with the players. And the players make nothing. I mean, they're making almost peanuts. And Miller can't believe it. He is absolutely stunned at the situation that the players find themselves in. And he tries to convince them that they're being exploited. And he's like, you don't have to live this way, right? Generations of American workers have stood up for their own rights. You can do the same. And the players don't see that. I mean, he's having a devil of a time trying to convince them of their plight. From the players' perspective, they're famous. They're ball players. They get to eat steak every night for dinner. I mean, they're small-town boys from the South who don't have a concept of what a union is or any notion about how they ought to be able to participate in the boundless economic riches of the game. They think, oh, people are cheering me and I get to play second base for the St. Louis Cardinals, right? So Miller is trying again and again to make this point with them, and it's not working. You know, one time, for example, he used to bring up the matter of baseball cards. The way that the Topps baseball card company would work in those days is they would go into the minors and they would identify promising players and they would sign them up. They get the players to sign over their rights for $5. And if they made it into the majors, they would pay them $125 a year. Right? And for that $125 a year, they got complete ownership of all of the photographing rights, you know, statistic, whatever, any use they wanted to make of the player's image. And they owed the players no royalties whatsoever. They essentially owned the player for $125 measly dollars. And Miller would say to these guys, you know, this is into the 70s this was going on. He would say, are you crazy? $125? Why would you sign that contract? And the players would say, you know, when I was a kid, I used to collect baseball cards, and now they want to put me on a baseball card. Right? That's what he was dealing with. So one spring, every spring he would make a tour of all the baseball teams, the spring training sites, and he's visiting the San Francisco Giants, and they had their spring training in Scottsdale, Arizona. And the center fielder of the San Francisco Giants in those years was, the right fielder was a guy named Bobby Bonds. And Bobby Bonds was one of the best players in baseball. He was this extraordinary combination of speed and power. And Miller knew what Bobby Bonds' salary was. He knew all the players' salary. And Bobby Bonds' salary was a joke. He was being paid nothing, despite the fact he was this extraordinary player, this exceptional talent. So he says to the player, he's having a big meeting with all the players, and he says, I'm going to make a prediction. And he points to Bobby Bonds' son. Now, all the players would bring their children to spring training. And Miller knew Bobby Bonds' son really well. He was this little kid. And it was clear, even at that point, that Bobby Bonds' son was going to be something special. He had that same rare combination of speed and power as his father. So he points to Bobby Bonds' son, and he says, I'm going to make a prediction. If we can get rid of the system that we have as we know it, then Bobby Bonds' son, if he makes it to the majors, will make more in one season than his father made in his entire career. Well, who was Bobby Bonds' son? Barry Bonds, right? One of the greatest players of his generation. And Miller was absolutely right. In fact, Barry Bonds made more in one season than the entire San Francisco Giants made in their entire career combined, right? $22 million he made in 2002. That is Marvin Miller's revolution. Right? That he took players from Bobby Bonds to Barry Bonds. And I think that all of us in this room and all of us in this society are still dealing with the consequences of that revolution. So in order to understand why Miller is such an extraordinary figure, I think it is important to realize something really crucial about the post-war years, something that we have forgotten, I think. And that is that from the end of the Second World War through the early 70s, high-level professionals, talented people at the top of whatever field they are in, I mean CEOs, investment bankers, writers, artists, singers, athletes, you name it, didn't make any money. When I say no money, I mean they made a fraction of what they make today, and their income relative to the average income in America was falling. So if you look at baseball players, for example, between the 1940s and the 1960s, both the game's minimum salary and the game's top salary fell by a third, right, in that period. In 1935, lawyers in this country made more than 4 times the average average American salary. By the mid-50s, they were making 2.4 times the average salary. That's how much they had seen their premium shrink in that period. The president of DuPont testifies before Congress in 1956, and he points out that his take-home pay is exactly half what his predecessor in the 30s had taken home. And if you read it's fascinating, if you read the kind of journalism about captains of industry and people at the top of their fields that was written in the 40s and the 50s, what's amazing about it is that the journalism is marveling at how ordinary their lives are. It's the exact opposite of that kind of journalism today, right? Instead of seeing pictures of these extraordinary palaces that you and I could never own, it's about the opposite. It's about how they're living in circumstances very similar to the rest of us. So there's this wonderful 1948 Wall Street Journal profile of a guy they call Mr. C, who is head of the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the United States. And the profile of this guy starts with the reporters with him in a taxi cab. And the guy, after he pays the taxi, writes down the amount of the taxi in his expense book. Right? This is the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the country. His after-tax income, the guy says, this guy's called Mr. C, is what he's called in the story. His after-tax income was $36,000 a year. And the year before that, his after-tax income had been $21,000 a year. So to put that in, you add a zero to get contemporary dollars. So this was a guy who was the head of one of the biggest companies in the country, and he was making around $300,000 a year. And he has this is the quote from the article that I love. This is right after the executive has said that his big extravagance was the previous year he had bought 2 cars, but he had to dip into his savings to afford it because he couldn't make it out of his salary. He says, my idea of fun would be to have a swimming pool because behind the house so I could take a dip whatever I want. But to build it, I'd have to sell a couple of my government bonds. I don't like to do that, so I'm getting along without the pool. Now, if anyone can find me a contemporary CEO of a Fortune 500 company who is capable with a straight face of uttering the phrase, so I'm getting along without the pool, I will give you a pool, right? So here's another one. This is from a Ladies' Home Journal article, 1959. Ladies' Home Journal sends a reporter to hang out with a guy named Mr. O'Rourke, who is, again, one of the CEOs of CEO of one of the biggest companies in the United States. And the reporter goes to Mr. O'Rourke's house in the suburbs of Chicago and gets a tour of the house given by the CEO's wife. And it's a 10-room Georgian, somewhere like in Winnetka or something like that. And the whole article is about how it's kind of dowdy. And the furniture's sort of old. And the wife is constantly apologizing that, well, we haven't been able to afford a decorator and we don't do this. And they have a summer house, but it's like this little cottage on a lake. It's sort of this little. And at the end of the article, the reporter interviews Mr. O'Rourke, this head of one of the biggest companies in the country. And he says, I'm the president of one of the larger companies in the U.S., yet chances are I will never become a millionaire. Right? That's the reality of the mid-50s. Now, why do they make so little money? Well, one reason is taxes back then are really, really high. The marginal income tax rate on incomes above $200,000 in that era is over 90%, right? So whenever you're trapped in a conversation with someone in the Hamptons who wants to tell you about how Obama is a socialist, and because he wants to let the Bush tax cuts expire, remind that person that one generation ago, people in his position paid 90% marginal tax rates on their income, right? But the other thing that's almost more important is, quite apart from taxes, salaries simply weren't that generous back then for professionals. And there was a feeling, if you talked to economists in that era, that this was a permanent condition, that the way in which the American economy had evolved had had the effect of severely and permanently limiting the income paid to talent, to people at the top of their profession. And the reasoning was, look, what happened in the post-war era was that the public education system, the public university system, expanded dramatically. So all of a sudden there were now 10 people applying for that one scarce job at whatever elite institution instead of 2. And that just meant that elite institutions could get by with paying their people a lot less money. Right? There's this great quote from a guy named Roswell Magel, who is a partner at Cravath, Swain & Moore, then is now one of the toniest of the law firms in this country. And he writes this extraordinary thing in the mid-50s. And it's basically about how he thinks that corporate law is going to die as a profession. And the reason he says is that they can't pay their people enough. And he says, law firms, and this is just a great quote, can no longer honestly assure promising young men that if they become partners, they can save money in substantial amounts, build country homes and gardens for themselves like their fathers and grandfathers did, and plan extensive European holidays. He thinks it's over. Right? And then what happens? The world changes. Almost, it seems like a flash. Taxes go down, salaries start to soar, baseball players become multimillionaires, CEOs start cashing enormous paychecks and even bigger bonuses and huge amount of stock options. And the very same lawyers at Cravath, Swaine, and Moore who once thought they could never build those houses and take those vacations and save that money begin building those houses and taking those vacations and saving all that money. So why does that happen? Well, there's all kinds of different explanations, and many economists have written about this, and many political scientists have talked about the shift in the politics that made this happen. But the explanation that I love, and the one that I want to dwell on today, is one that was given by a guy named Roger Martin, who's dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, who wrote a really extraordinary article for the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. And he argued that it came about, this transition, this transformation, because of a change in sensibility on the part of the most talented people in our society. That they came to realize, talented people did, that what they possessed was rare, was scarce, and that what capital possessed, in other words, what the people running all of these companies had, was all of a sudden abundant. And people like those CEOs, Mr. C and Mr. O'Rourke, and people like Roswell Magel, woke up to what they were worth. Right? Woke up and realized, oh, wait a minute, I can get a whole lot more money than I've been asking for. And who wakes them up? Marvin Miller wakes them up. And when does he wake them up? 1975. So Miller, one of the very first meetings that Miller attends in his new role as union chief is a meeting of the executive committee of baseball, which is all of the honchos of the game. And it's in Chicago. And he's going there, and he sits down in this big room, and he has a certain expectation about what a meeting is from his days at the United Steelworkers. And he's absolutely flabbergasted by what happened. The topic under discussion that day was that the owners had decided to change the rules by which they funded the players' pension system. There had been a system in place, an agreement in place between the owners and the players going back for 10 years that said that 60% of the broadcast revenue from the World Series was going to go into a pot of money to fund the players' pension system. But the owners in 1966 were about to sign a huge new television contract. And that sum of money was going to grow so large that the owners decided, wait a minute, if we give them 60% of this suddenly huge number, we're going to be giving them twice as much money, and we're not going to do that. So we're going to switch this whole system to a flat fee. Right? And Miller, who spent his whole life as a negotiator on behalf of the interests of labor, is waiting for the negotiation to begin. And there's no negotiation. They just announce it. It's what they're going to do. And they look at him like he's a potted plant, like he's just some person who's just sitting in a corner taking up space. And he's absolutely, like I said, flabbergasted. And he sits there stunned. Not only that, what they're doing is illegal. It contravenes the labor law of the United States of America. And there are lawyers people in that room who had been trained in labor law, right? Chief among them, Bowie Kuhn. And he looks at Bowie Kuhn, waiting for Bowie Kuhn to say, excuse me, gentlemen, you've just broken the law. Bowie Kuhn says nothing. Now think about the situation that he's in. Miller has just taken over this pathetic union, this union that was set up by the owners so they could control it. And he doesn't have any staff. He doesn't really have any revenue, any kind of budget at that moment. And he's up against the owners. And who are the owners of baseball in 1966? These are some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country. Right? And whenever the players in previous years had tried to do battle with the owners in court, they'd always lost. In fact, the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of the owners. Congress had passed laws exempting the owners from antitrust provisions. They had all the power, right? And not only that, his own union, the players in his own union don't even understand what a union is. They think that their lives are wonderful and they're being well treated by the owners. They don't even understand that to sign away their rights for $125 to the Topps baseball card company is a bad idea. This is a guy, in other words, who is in an incredibly weak position. Right? what's he going to do? So what does he do? Well, he's Marvin Miller. He fights back. And what happens? He wins. Right? The minute he stands up and says, wait a minute, you can't do that. You've just broken the law. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how many politicians you have in your pocket. I don't care what the Supreme Court has said. You have just broken labor law. And they go, oh. Right? And they back down. And then he realizes, wait a minute, maybe I've got more power than I realize. And so he goes back the next year and he says, from now on, we're going to negotiate through a collective bargaining agreement. And they go, okay. And he wins that round. And then he says, I want arbitration for grievances and for salary disputes. And they go, oh, okay. And he wins arbitration for salary disputes. And won over the years as he's head of union, the baseball players union, he wins one concession after another and slowly transforms this union until he wins the biggest prize of all, which is free agency. He finally wins the right of a player after serving a certain number of years in the league to be able to negotiate for himself what team he plays for, right? The single most important moment in the history of labor relations in baseball. And what year does he negotiate free agency finally for the players? 1975. Now, here's the crucial thing about all this, right? Over the course of this period, that he is utterly transforming the face of the game and proving to these previously powerless players that they actually had power and they could participate in the largesse of the game. No one thought it was going to be that easy. Everyone thought it was going to be this long, difficult, drawn-out, protracted battle. And the stunning thing is just how simple it all was. How easy it was to push at capital and have capital just kind of crumble. At one point, Miller takes his players out on a strike. And it's over something that, in retrospect, seems incredibly trivial. There was a surplus in the pension fund of the players. And the players said, look, that's surplus. Why don't you just put it back into the fund and use it to pay for higher benefits? And the owners said, no, absolutely not. Over our dead body, right? That contravenes every principle, blah, 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 blah. So Miller says, all right, we're going to strike. And it's the first strike in the history of professional sports. And even Miller this time thinks, this one is going to be long and bloody, right? The owners have dug in their heels. This is going to be a tough one. And he tells all the players, be prepared, right? And they go out there and they're solid and they do the first strike in the history of professional sports and they hunker down for a lost baseball season. And what happens? After 13 days, the owners fold like an accordion. Boom, right? Give in. In fact, there's a wonderful summary of the New York Times, in the New York Times of the strike by Leonard Copeland, who's an old sports writer of that era. I love this. This is his summary of the strike. Players, we want higher pensions. Owners, we won't give you one damn cent for that. Players, you don't have to. The money's already there. Just let us use it. Owners, it would be imprudent. Players, we did it before, and anyhow, we won't play unless we can have some of it. Owners, okay. Now you have to imagine what kind of signal that sent to all of these professionals around the country who had seen their incomes falling ever since the end of the war, right? They had seen their money they were making go down and down and their status sink lower and lower. And they look over at baseball and they see this guy, this little wiry guy with a Fu Manchu mustache and a Brooklyn honk, take on the most powerful people in the game of baseball and some of the wealthiest people in the country and win. Right? Can you imagine what kind of an example that set for other professionals who were engaged in a very similar kind of battle? Right around the same time that Miller is transforming baseball, there's a parallel revolution going on, literally up the street. The Major League Baseball Players Association was on 42nd Street, literally a few blocks away in Midtown. There is a parallel revolution taking place in the publishing world. And the Marvin Miller of that particular revolution is a man named Mort Janklow. And Mort Janklow is a corporate lawyer. He's practicing in New York, and he has one of his friends from college is William Safire. Right? They're old college buddies. And William Safire is a speechwriter for the Nixon White House. And he decides to leave after the 72 election. And he wants to write a memoir, and he calls up his friend Mort, and he says, I know you're not a literary agent, and You've never done anything in the literary world, but you're my lawyer. I want you to sell this memoir for me. So Janklow says, all right, and he goes and he sells the memoir to William Morrow. Right? And then 9 months pass, and William Safire hands in the manuscript on time to William Morrow, and then Janklow gets a call a couple of weeks later from the editor at William Morrow, and the editor says, you know what, we don't like it. We don't think it works as a memoir. I'm sorry, tell your friend Bill that we're going to have to pass on this one, and by the way, we'd like our advance back. Right? Now, that's the way the contracts were written back then. Believe it or not, the deal that was struck in those years between publishers and authors was, if the publisher didn't deem the manuscript acceptable, they got to ask for their money back, to claw back the money they'd given you to write the manuscript. Right? It is as if after a year of work in a new job, your boss would come to you and say, you know what, really wasn't happy with your work this year. I'd like you to give me your salary back. Right? That's the way it was. So what Janklow decides is that he's going to fight. First of all, he knows the book's not terrible. The book's great. He knows the real reason they want to do that is because of a funny little thing that happened between the time he made that deal with William Morrow and the time the manuscript was handed in. And that funny little thing was Watergate, right? That Safire was unlucky enough to have left the White House just before Watergate and handed in his manuscript after Watergate, and no publisher wants to publish a Nixon book without any mention of Watergate, right? So they're just they trumped up this thing about not liking the manuscript. All it was they'd made an unlucky business decision. And he also doesn't like this fact that the way the contract is written between the talent, the author, and Capital, the publisher, totally is in favor of Capital. He thinks that's crazy, right? So he decides he's going to fight. So he gets sent to the law firm that represents William Morrow, which is from Greenbaum, Wolf & Ernst, and the partner of that law firm is a guy named Maury Greenbaum. And as Janklow describes it, Greenbaum is one of these classic aristocratic fourth-generation German Jews, with a little pince right here. And Janklow is like off-the-boat Russian Jew. So you can imagine the kind of dynamic between them. And Greenbaum just starts to give him a lecture like he's 18 years old about, he says, you have to understand, young man, we are in a standards business. You can't force a publisher to publish a book. That's the way this business has worked for hundreds of years. And Janklow says, look, I'm not trying to force the publisher to publish this book. I'm trying to force the publisher to pay for this book, like the contract says, right? And he says, I'm going to sue. And, Greenbaum, like the vein on his forehead starts like popping out. And he turns to Janklow and says, of course, young man, if you sue, you will never work in this town again, right? So Janklow sues. And what happens? He wins, right? He takes on Capital, and Capital crumbles. And as soon as that happened, every major author in town says, wait a minute, that's the guy I want to be my agent, right? And with that newfound power, Janklow goes back and he rewrites the contract. So all of a sudden, the balance of power between authors and publishers shifts. And instead of the author being in the position of just doing whatever the publisher said, finally they get real rights, right? It's the exact same story as the Miller story, right? The outsider comes in and shakes things up and sets up on behalf of Capital and of talent and looks at Capital and says the way you're doing things is unacceptable. And Capital, which everyone thought was impregnable, crumbles. Well, if you look across American society in the mid-'70s, you will see versions of this story happen again and again and again. Right? There's a private equity investor in the mid-'70s called Teddy Forsman. And like all private equity guys back then, the way he got paid was he set up a fund with all of his investors, and he took a 2% or 1.5% management fee. And all of a sudden he wakes up and he says to himself in 1975, I think I deserve more. I don't see why I should just work for. I'm doing all the work. I think I should get 20% of profits too. Right? Which at the time seemed like an absolutely outrageous request. But when he went to all of his investors and said, I want not just 2% of management fee, I want 20% of profits. You know what they said? Sure. Right? And all of a sudden now, every single hedge fund guy and private equity person in this entire country gets 2 and 20. 2% of management, 20% of profits. In Hollywood, same period, mid-'70s, a guy named George Lucas. Right? goes to 20th Century Fox and says, I've got this movie called Star Wars. You may or may not be interested in it, but if you do want to make it, I have a simple request. I would like you to give me full ownership of every single sequel to this movie. An outrageous request, one that no one had ever made before of capital in Hollywood. And what does 20th Century Fox say? Sure, we'll give it to you. Exact same year, supermodel named Lauren Hutton. She gets sick of the fact that, like all supermodels, she's making $60 an hour, right? And doesn't have any kind of contractual relationship with anyone. So she goes to her photographer, Richard Avedon, and they're working at that moment on this campaign with Revlon, and Revlon really, really loves her, and she says, if they love me so much, they ought to pay me properly. Right? They ought to give me a real contract. And all of a sudden, she goes from making $60 an hour to making $25,000 a day. Right? Now, where did she get the idea for that? Well, this is what she said in an interview last year in Vogue. I read an article about a sports guy named Catfish Hunter on the bottom right-hand corner of the New York Times front page. It said he was going to get $1 million contract. I yelled over to my boyfriend and asked, how do I get a contract like that? Now, who was Catfish Hunter? Catfish Hunter was a pitcher for the New York Yankees. He was the first free agent created by Marvin Miller's revolution. He was the first millionaire in baseball created by this new age, this new transformation that Miller brought about, right? So you start with Marvin Miller, and you go to Mort Janklow, and you go to Teddy Forsman, and you go to George Lucas, and you go to Lauren Hutton, and then where do you go from Lauren Hutton? Back to Marvin Miller. And when does it all happen? 1975. So what's going on here? What causes this transformation in 1975 that allows so many different people to start demanding more from the institutions that they work with? Well, there's two economists named Chacker and Hesterly wrote this really lovely paper last year trying to explain this. And they draw on the work of an anthropologist named Alan Fiske. And Fiske is a guy who famously has argued that when people use one of four, what he calls relational models, when they interact with one another. So the first kind of relational model is what Fiske calls communal sharing. And that's a group of roommates in a house who all read each other's books and listen to each other's music and share each other's socks. Right? That's obvious. The second model is equality matching, and that's tit for tat. So a carpool is equality matching. I drive your kid to school on Monday, you drive my kid to school on Tuesday. Right? The third is market pricing, supply and demand. We negotiate the terms of our relationship according to what the market allows, permits. Right? And the fourth relational model is authority ranking. That's paternalism. That's where we have someone who we look up to, who we allow to make decisions on our behalf, who has that kind of paternalistic relationship to our rights and obligations. And so what Fiske says is we use these models in various ways according to tradition, ritual, circumstance, experience, and we use a variety of them, right? We shift from one model to the other. So he says, imagine a dinner party. You buy the food at a store according to a price that's determined by the market. That's market pricing. Some of the people you invite to your house for dinner because they have invited you to their house for dinner in the past, right? That's equality matching. When people arrive, you set all the food on a sideboard and they all serve themselves. That's communal sharing. But they sit in a seat that you assign. You decide that you want Mary next to Jim and Jim next to Helen, right? That's authority ranking. Right? Now, so in one dinner party, we use all four different relational models. Now, imagine if we just shift the relational models just a little bit. Imagine if you were to use equality matching to get your food. Imagine if you just you had done a favor for someone at Whole Foods last week, and in return, they give you some food you said, I'll advertise Whole Foods on my website, and in exchange, they give you some food for free, right? Now imagine if you did communal sharing for your invitations. You just said to friends, invite whoever you want, right? That's all. Imagine if you did authority ranking for the choice of what to serve. You said, we're all going to have chicken pot pie, right? That's it. And imagine if you did market pricing for the invitations. People would pay to come to your dinner party. Now, you could have the same guest list and the same food and the same venue on the same day at the same time, but merely by changing the nature of your social relations, right, you have turned a private dinner party into a community fundraiser. Right? That's how profound these sort of relational models, how profound an impact these kinds of relational models have on the way that we order our universe. When you shift from one kind of relational model to another, you bring about an extraordinary transformation in the nature of the transaction and the nature of your relationship with the people that you're working with. And what Chekar and Hessley say is, when you look at what happened in the 1970s, in 1975, that's what you're seeing. We had a shift in relational models. We went from authority ranking to market pricing. Right? And that simple shift had the effect of fundamentally reordering our world. So think about baseball along these lines. The really big thing that Miller defeated in his time as the head of the union was what was called the reserve clause. And the reserve clause was a line in the contract that every baseball player had to sign that said essentially that the baseball team that you sign with owns your rights in perpetuity. So if you sign a contract with the New York Yankees at the age of 17, that the New York Yankees own you. You cannot play for anyone else. Right? The only way you can play for anyone else is if the New York Yankees decide to sell your contract to someone else. Right? Essentially, it's a kind of legalized slavery. Right? You have no freedom of movement. And now when Miller comes along in the mid-60s, that's what outrages him about baseball. That's what he can't believe. Right? He walks into the system and he sees, oh my goodness, all these guys I'm representing have signed over their freedoms to the teams they play for. And by the way, it's not just when you sign the reserve clause, it doesn't just rob you of your freedom. It robs you of your bargaining power. How on earth do you negotiate a higher salary if you cannot play for any other team? Right? The only threat you can make is to quit. You can't say, I'm going to go across the street and play for the Brooklyn Dodgers, right? Because they'll say, you can't. No, I own you in perpetuity. So he tries to explain to the players, right? Do you guys realize what you've done by signing this? You have made it impossible to ever negotiate a proper contract, to ever get paid for your true value. And the players don't get it. And that's what when he's beating his head against the wall in the early days, what he's trying to do is to convince the players to see this, right? To see the extent to which they are being exploited by this system. Well, why don't they see it? Why is it so hard? Because they are in the grip of authority ranking. Right? Because they have used that relational model to define their terms of engagement with the owners. They have decided, look, this is paternalism. The owners take care of me. They buy my steaks after dinner. They slip me $20 when I play really well. They allow me to play second base, and they clean my uniform after I'm done. This is a great system, right? I get to do the thing I love, play baseball, and they do all the worrying about how much I should get paid and where I should go. And what Miller is trying to do is to get them to shift to market pricing. And that's a really hard transition. Right? It seems simple, but in fact, it requires this extraordinary leap from one model to the next. Now, if you look at what was going on in the professions prior to 1975, you see authority ranking all over the place. That was the reason why professionals were getting paid so little in those years, because they were passively adopting a set of standards and expectations that was set by the institutions that they worked for. There's this wonderful book I read 2 years ago by Charles Ellis. It's a book about Goldman Sachs, history of Goldman Sachs. And he tells the story of Sidney Weinberg, who is the guy who really builds that firm into the colossus that it's become. He runs Goldman Sachs from 1930 to the end of the 60s. And there's an incredible passage, which I'll never forget, which is that Weinberg is, in the mid-50s, is tapped to lead the initial public offering of the Ford Motor Company, right? To take Ford Motor Company public. It is the biggest IPO in history up to that point. And if you adjust the dollar amounts, it's the biggest IPO of all time. It's an incredible, we're talking about Ford at the height of its power, right? It's the equivalent of Microsoft and IBM and Apple and Google going public simultaneously, right? A massive thing. And they want Sidney Weinberg and Goldman Sachs to do the deal, to represent them. So here's the crucial passage when Ellis is describing what happens in that deal. When Henry Ford had asked Weinberg at the outset what his fee would be, Weinberg had declined to get specific. He offered to work for $1 a year until everything was over, and then let the family decide what his efforts were really worth. Far more than the actual fee, Weinberg always said he appreciated an affectionate handwritten letter he received from Ford, which says, along with other flattering things, "Without you, it could not have been accomplished." Weinberg had the letter framed and hung in his office, where he would proudly direct visitors' attention to it, saying, "That's the big payoff as far as I'm concerned." He was speaking more literally than his guests knew. The fee finally paid was estimated at the time to be as high as $1 million. The actual fee was nowhere near that amount. For 2 years' work and a dazzling success, the indispensable man was paid only $250,000. Now, let us go over, point by point, that surreal passage from just 50 years ago. 1, he asked for $1 a year. Is there a banker on the face of the earth today who would agree to be paid $1 a year at the outset of a transaction and just let the client give him whatever bonus he wanted, right? 2, a thank you note. Is there a banker on the face of the earth today who would say, point to a thank you, a handwritten thank you note on his wall and say, that's the payoff as far as I'm concerned? Point number 3, $250,000 for handling the biggest IPO in human history. Today, that fee would be, I don't even know. Are there any bankers in the room? Not maybe 250 million, maybe 2 billion. I don't know. I mean, today it would be many, many multiples of that. That fee is so low, it's unbelievable. It's mind-boggling that you could work on a deal, the biggest deal in history, for 2 years and get paid $250,000 and not complain about it. You know, think about this for a moment. Weinberg is the most important banker of his era. He is the single most powerful man on Wall Street. He did that deal because Ford came to him and begged for him personally to handle it. He has all of the negotiating power in the world. Right? Today, in that same position, he could have cut the most lucrative deal ever given in an investment bank in history. But he doesn't. And why doesn't he? Because he's in the grip of authority ranking. Because his assumption is that as an investment banker, he works for the client. He works for Ford, and he is obliged to take whatever Ford gives him, right? Whether it's $5 or $5 million, and whether it's a pat in the back or a handwritten note. What has changed today in that world is not simply that there is an extra 0 or 2 zeros on the end of any one of those deals. What's changed today is that investment bankers are no longer in the grip of authority ranking, right? Now they believe in market pricing. They assume that everything's up for negotiation. And that's exactly what the nature of that transaction, that disagreement was between Mort Janklow and Maury Greenbaum. Maury Greenbaum assumed, as he, glared at Mort Janklow over his pince-nez, he assumed that the order of the social relations in the publishing world was authority ranking, right? That the social relations were settled, that everybody was in agreement on that's what the model was. And Janklow is saying, no, it's not settled. Let's do market pricing, right? I think that's fair. That's what that disagreement's about. And when Teddy Forsman comes along and says, I want 20% of profits, not just 2% of fees under management, he's not saying that because he's somehow more acquisitive or rapacious than other equity fund managers who'd come before him. It's because he's got a different model. He says, why should I just passively accept the terms that investors have been offering for years and years and years? It's open to negotiation. I want 20%. And if you say yes, great. And if you don't, no big deal. Go somewhere else. Right? Same thing that Lauren Hutton is saying. She's saying, why should I passively take $60 an hour? If Revlon likes me so much, they got to pay for me. Right? I'll work for them, but they got to pay what I'm really worth in this marketplace, which is $25,000 a day. And she gets $25,000 a day. Right? Well, that is the Marvin Miller revolution. He's bringing market pricing to places where market pricing had never been considered as an option before. So, to the crucial question, and that is this a good thing? Are we better off for having transformed the professional world by using the prism of market pricing? Well, in one sense, the answer is yes. Of course we're better off, right? The old system was exploitation. There's no reason why the baseball owner should keep all the money, or why Ford should get away with paying peanuts for that IPO, or why Lauren Hutton should work for $60 an hour. Right? And that is the great part, the powerful and useful and lasting contribution that Miller makes, is he begins to even the scales, to make sure that society properly appreciates the contributions of people who have exceptional abilities. But there's another part of this that's more complicated. And that is that what Miller was doing is he was taking a model that had been tried out in the world of organized labor, right? Market pricing and an end to authority ranking is what the trade union movement was all about. Right? That they figured out way back when, 50 years before the professionals did, that if you organized collectively, and if you were consistent and stood firm in your demands, you could get a lot more money. Right? And the history of the steelworkers and the United Auto Workers and the Teamsters through the 30s and 40s and 50s and early 60s is a testament to that fact. And what Miller does is he says, look, this idea worked so well in the ranks of the working class, let's try it in the professional class. And so he convinces professionals to think in that moment like trade unionists, right? To understand that let's test our pay in the marketplace, not according to some kind of custom or ritual. But the thing is, there's a huge difference between trade unionism in the working class and trade unionism in the professional class. People who are in trade unions are people who don't have significant financial or social resources. They're people whose skills are not necessarily exceptional. They're people who can be replaced by their company if they threaten to walk across the street. They need that kind of collective organization in order to have a fair fight with capital. Right? But professionals are different. They do have significant financial and social resources. They do have exceptional talents. And when they threaten to go across the street, it's a real threat because they're really, really hard to replace. And so when they organize collectively, it's not a fair fight anymore. It's a rout. Right? And what happens in baseball after Miller brings about his revolution is a rout. All of a sudden, talent goes from making this much to making this much. Right? The share of baseball revenues given over to players' salaries goes from 10% in the 60s to upwards of 60% by the early 1990s. Barry Bonds, that little boy who was playing at his father's feet back in the early 70s, makes $22 million in 2004, which is not just more than his father's entire team made in their entire career combined. That's more than many owners made in 2004. That's the big question left by Miller's revolution, and that is in bringing about this transformation and in bringing about market pricing, does the balance tip too far in the favor of talent? And when you look around and you see that growing gulf between the top 1% of this country and the rest of us, and you see that widening inequality, and you see the extraordinary salaries paid by people on Wall Street, you have to ask yourself, is this because of Miller's revolution? Is this the unintended consequence of freeing us from the shackles of authority pricing? You know, when Robert Nardelli leaves Home Depot a couple years ago, when he is, I should say, forced out by the board of Home Depot because they were unhappy with its performance, he takes home a severance package worth $210 million. Now, why does he take home that much money? Because he wrote that into his contract when he was hired. And why on earth would you write into a contract when you hire somebody that in the event that we force you out because we don't like you and think you're terrible, we'll still pay you $210 million? Why? Because that's the situation that capital is in now. They can't say no to talent anymore. Right? It's not a fair fight. It's a rout. You have to do what talent says, even when it turns out that talent isn't all that talented. Right? You know, the problem with the old system of authority ranking was arrogance. People at the top, people who were in that position of authority, abused their privilege and made demands on those who worked for them that were outrageous. But the new system has a problem as well, and that's greed. That people who has this kind of power to demand salaries demand far more than they actually should. There's a wonderful phrase that Roger Martin says. He says, the professional class has gone from asking the question, how much is enough, to asking the question, how much can I get? When I was talking with Marvin Miller, I was reminded of this famous story about Stan Musial. And Stan Musial was a player who came along in the generation before Marvin Miller, and he was one of the great baseball players of his era. And one season, he has, later in his career, he has one of his worst seasons as a baseball player. Terrible season. He hit 75 points below his average. And so he goes to the owners of the St. Louis Cardinals and the general manager of his team, and he says, I think you should cut my pay by 20%. He was making $100,000, and he said, I think you should cut me back to 80%. Now, I know what Marvin Miller would say if you told him that story. He'd be outraged by it. He'd say, first of all, at $100,000, Musial was being underpaid by several orders of magnitude. He would also say, and do you really think that if Musial had the greatest career of his season, the team would have turned around and given him an extra 20%? No way, right? And in both cases, Miller would be absolutely right in pointing to the fundamental unfairness of that system. But it's really hard to look around today at all of these billion-dollar pay packages of hedge fund people and all the private jets landing one after another at Teterboro and the massive palaces being built by the new princes of our Gilded Age, and not feel just a little bit nostalgic for what Musial said when he was asked to give an explanation for why he asked for that pay cut. It has been a very long time since anyone, any kind of talent, said something like this. Musial said, there wasn't anything noble about it. I had a lousy year. I didn't deserve the money. Thank you. We have time for questions. I think there are microphones at the top of the aisle, and I would be happy to. Sure, go ahead.
I like coming to listen to you, and it's a little bit of an event, and I think of you as a little bit of an icon as well. Coming here and compare you somewhat to Steve Jobs, who's also an icon.
Much richer icon than I am. Yes.
And so your talk is like, is it going to be like the next iPhone? That's how I think of your next talk. So I'm wondering, what kind of pressure is there in coming up with the ideas for your next talk?
Oh.
What anxieties
do I have?
Neuroses involved in thinking this up?
Well, anyone who is in a creative field is aware that you never escape the anxiety about where the next idea is coming from, or if in fact you'll ever have another idea. Yesterday I was doing I did a talk with Bill Simmons, the sports writer, at the festival, and we were talking about this whole question of how long do you have, how long a stretch do creative people have where they can perform at a high level? And Bill was arguing that it was 9 years. I don't know where he got the number 9 years, but and I was sort of thinking, when did I start? And so I think I'm probably outside of my envelope. So what I'm saying is it's all downhill from here. Sure.
That was great. To what do you attribute the willingness of capital and perhaps the willingness of the masses to change so dramatically and so quickly to market-based pricing?
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting question. There's a number of different... Roger Martin, whose work I mentioned, he wrote this piece for the Harvard Business Review. And his argument is it's both a change in sensibility, that is to say, talent changes its position, But there's a fundamental economic piece as well, which is that the reason capital had such power for so long was that capital was scarce. There wasn't a lot of money. The big thing that if you had access to capital, if you could put together money to start a business, you were in an incredibly powerful position because very few people had that kind of access. And what happens in the 60s is the kind of pool of money available for new business ventures grows dramatically. And that means that destroys the bargaining position of those who organize pools of capital. So in baseball, he would say, correctly, that Miller comes along precisely at the time as the television revenues for baseball are exploding. And it becomes really, really hard for the owners to claim that they get 90% of everything when the pot is suddenly 10 times larger. So there's that piece of it. And that's happening simultaneously in all kinds of different worlds. You know, that there's a creation of a mass market in the 60s that allows talent to cash in. But I think it's very important not to give it just simply a structural explanation. That I do think that that the shift from one relational model to another, which seems inconceivable, like when you're trapped in authority ranking, you can't even conceive of market pricing. But the minute you see it work, authority ranking just kind of vanishes. You can't go back, right? To me, it's a good example of when does discipline in a classroom break down? When authority ranking disappears and you go to market pricing. Or when you go to, any number of the other relational models in a classroom are disastrous. Communal sharing, equality matching, these are not good ways to. So I just think there's something so dramatic about that change in perspective. And it just runs through the professional ranks like a contagion in 1975.
I have two questions for you. One, 1975 is also the coming of age of the very beginning of the baby boomers. And very close to the year 1977 when Marshall McLuhan made the very famous statement that it used to be in America that when someone would notice that someone was able to get a son or a daughter into a position by connections as opposed to talent, people would be outraged. People would stand up and protest. Whereas as of 1977, people were saying, how could I get my son or my daughter into that? So he was seeing a destruction, slow destruction of values in the United States. The second question I have is, so my first question is, how do you relate this excessive emphasis on talent and the power of talent to the me baby boomers coming of age? And secondly, that generation is now heading into retirement and some of them are already there. What do you think the next generation of Americans are going to present as a model for not only the market but also for human values?
Yeah. Two good questions. To the first, I'm going to answer it narrowly. I do think there's obviously a piece of this. It is not coincidental that all of this happens, you're right, as the baby boomers are gaining positions of authority in the workforce, the middle of the me decade. More crucially, though, I remember asking Miller this. I said, you know, the arguments he was making about baseball players and their rights were powerfully analogous to the arguments being made in the civil rights movement of the same era, of the 60s. Mm-hmm. And so I said, I remember asking him, I said, well, was that an issue? Did you find that the black players in baseball were more open to this message than the white players? And he said, absolutely. In fact, he began to list so many of the key figures in the baseball union were black. And they absolutely saw a connection between the broader and much more important struggle in society and this little microcosmic struggle that they were involved in. So there is a kind of leakage of values of values from outside into these professional ranks. The other question is a really good one too. What kind of relational model do we think that people will hold today? I suspect that we still have a talent-focused model, but what talent wants today is not to get paid, because I think they realize they can't get paid in the same way. I think what they want is to be free in the sense of what they're looking for is autonomy, is the freedom to behave as creatively in whatever ways they wish without the constraints of institutions or That's the kind of that's their version of the market pricing paradigm.
So they're going to trade the money for
Yeah.
freedom to express themselves.
Yeah, because the generation that is 25 and below are making, in many cases, a fraction of what their predecessors made now. The same cycle is not coming the other way.
Because the pool of money is gone.
Yeah. Sure.
You describe it as kind of a paradigm shift from the authority ranking to the market pricing model. I was wondering if perhaps there are all of those paradigms were happening simultaneously, not just from A to B. Because, for instance, you've got CEOs who are who are now also on the boards of the companies, and chairman of the companies, and on the compensation committees for the companies. Are they doing authority ranking for their own salaries? Is it an equality matching for their fellow, for their cronies on other boards and things like that?
Yeah. No, you're right. So it gets tricky. And then this, a version of my talk will appear in the magazine. And I deal with these articles, with your point a little more, I flesh it out a little more in the magazine. But I think you're right. So part of what happens to market pricing is with, say, CEO pay, is it gets completely corrupted. Market pricing assumes that there is a negotiation between relatively equal parties. And what you're seeing when Nardelli gets $210 million for being fired, that's not a negotiation, that's a capitulation, right? So we move beyond. And when there's a study that I cite, which is a study that said, what are the predictors of excessive compensation for CEOs? And it turns out that how much you make as a CEO has very little to do with the nature of the business that you're in or with the success of the company that you run. But it has everything to do with the average compensation of the members of your compensation board on your board of directors. In other words, it's all about the reference point that the guys setting your salaries have for their salaries.
That's equality matching.
Yeah, that is equality matching, yes. So there is a kind of, the paradigm gets corrupted again once you move into these rarefied sort of circles, CEO compensation circles. So what's funny is how briefly the market pricing paradigm rules before it gets corrupted again. Maybe there's clearly a kind of cyclical process in which we move in the commercial realm from one of these paradigms to another, depending on the self-interest of the most powerful party. Right?
Thank you. I discovered that there were tones of what you said that were similar to the recent article written about the new book about Serge Diaghilev, strangely enough, and the power that he wielded at that time. But my question is really more of one of aesthetics and related to baseball, which is how far does the full quote attributed to Branch Rickey, of which only the latter half is often cited, how far do you think that affects the things that you've been speaking about, where intelligence and effort combining at their best equal the residue of design?
Oh dear, that's a difficult question. What is the half of that quote that we often? Is there a second half to that quote that is?
It's supposedly when the Dodgers won the World Series
Yeah.
with Jackie Robinson, they asked him, "Don't you feel lucky today?" And he said, "Luck is what happens when intelligence and effort combine at their best. Luck is the residue of design."
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that that particular quote. Ricky, interesting, or it is an interesting question about whether the integration of the game is a kind of precursor of Miller's revolution a generation ahead, because once you basically bit by bit the notion of baseball as the kind of private fiefdom of a set of owners that is run according to their whims, however racist or they may be, is broken down bit by bit. And the first barrier that falls is you explain to the owner that actually you are obliged to look for people who are great baseball players wherever they may come from, right? Even if they come from places. And then the second thing is you are obliged to pay them properly, right? Once you have, so there's a kind of there is this continual process of rationalizing the terms of the game. And we forget how appallingly retrograde labor relations were in that world. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. Even more astonishing, by the way, is that Marvin Miller is not in the Hall of Fame. If you remember, the Hall of Fame, the criteria for entry to the Hall of Fame is impact, contributions made to the game of baseball. There is no one outside of Babe Ruth and Jackie Robinson who made a greater contribution to the game of baseball in the 20th century than Marvin Miller. They put announcers into the Hall of Fame. The guy who said "Holy cow" is in the Hall of Fame, right? Marvin Miller, who changed this. I mean, and this man is sitting in his apartment, up on the east side. He's the only guy who didn't get rich, right? Everybody else made millions and millions of dollars. He never made more than his union salary, nor did he ask to make more than his union salary. When he was asked if he would serve upon his retirement as an agent for the players, he said no. Why? Because he felt it would be wrong and a violation of his position as a union man. This is a man who selflessly served the interests of the game of baseball, wrenched it single-handedly into the modern era. And how did they reward him? By turning their backs on him. Why? Because to this day, the owners are a retrograde group who deserve... I mean, I almost feel there should be a day every year where all Americans boycott the game of baseball until they come to their senses and put this man where he belongs, which is alongside the greats of the game in the Hall of Fame.
Thank you. It seems that the market model is based off of scarcity. And to what extent do you see a sliding scale between authority figures, market pricing, where if the position of scarcity changes, it's just a new, through looking glass version of authority?
Yeah, well, it goes to what I was talking about with the previous questioner from that side, which is that these paradigms start to get really fluid. We sort of cycle through these different versions, and depending on who is in power. I mean, I suppose that is the biggest change. What happens, perhaps a better way of explaining the shift in 1975 is, in 1975, the social relations were up until then were settled. That is to say, we had authority ranking and nothing else, and a predictable set of characters at the top of the system. The publisher ruled. Right? And we knew who they were, and they were like 5 houses, and they dictated terms to everybody. And then what happens in 75 is that it's all up for grabs. That sometimes the publisher can rule according to authority ranking or some other paradigm, but sometimes it can be somebody else. And at various times, maybe that's a purer way, I think, of explaining this transition, that we've simply, that in terms of open negotiation, it is not simply the money being paid that's up for grabs. It's also the model we're going to use to decide how the money is being paid that's up for grabs. I think that's a better way to rephrase it. Sure.
I'm sorry your parents couldn't be here today.
I am too.
I hope they're well.
They're very well. They just decided, I think, there's a certain point when they know where this is headed, right? So they're like, how many of these talks can we realistically be asked to attend?
I found out recently that we have a common ancestor, John Ford.
Oh, my goodness.
And when I posted on Facebook, I'm going to go see Cousin Malcolm, someone told me about the PBS documentary, Faces of America, and I got to read your chapter. And I was wondering, thanks for bringing to light the whole mythology that I was brought up to believe about my father's side of the family. So thanks for that. I was wondering if you were going to write any more about that.
Well, I don't know what, I sort of feel that, you know those people who write a memoir and then it does really well and then they write another memoir and then they write, that as well. So like, that, okay, they come up with a third memoir and so the first one spans, this much, and the second one is like this much, and then the third one is like the time that elapsed between their previous memoir and their... So there are diminishing returns to any kind of personal writing. And I think I'm at the point of diminishing returns. I think I have clearly exhumed every interesting fact about my family and my own personal background. So it's best, I think, that I move on to more fertile pastures. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm a public school teacher, so when you spoke of paternalism, I immediately thought of my classroom. But then it occurred to me that the entire New York City school system and school systems around the country are, in my opinion, built still on paternalism and maybe even some community sharing. And I feel like a lot of the school reforms that are being talked about have to do with the market. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that and if that was a positive or negative thing.
Yeah. Oh, such an interesting question. You're right. I hadn't thought about it in that way. That it is a lot of what is called, for better or worse, education reform. You're right. Is an attempt to bring market pricing to some corner, not the whole piece, some crucial piece of the. I will say, I am in part. I think that can be very, very useful, or at least I'd be willing to experiment with it. But I will also say that, the Canadian in me is very suspicious of attempts to completely transform public goods into market-based systems. The best example of this is the continuing mess in the healthcare system in this country is in large part due to the fact that we persist in trying to use a market pricing model where it's not appropriate, I think. I mean, in Canada, we use what would it be? It would be a communal sharing model for our healthcare. And it strikes me, and most countries do, Western countries do, and it strikes me that's a more appropriate. So it requires you to, the reason that the healthcare debate in this country never really got off the ground is that no one ever took a step back and examined the social relations paradigm we were using to organize the reform. What did we want, right? Did we want a system that that provided every American with an equal chance for a decent amount of health care? That is a communal sharing model. That was the Canadian choice. Now that means you sacrifice all kinds of other things. The kinds of things you can only get with market pricing, which is really, really high-end services for the wealthy, which you can't get in Canada. Right? Limited access to. It doesn't matter how rich you are. If you want to get a certain kind of access to some super-duper expensive something, you go to Buffalo. Right? It might be the only circumstance that you go to Buffalo. But I say that as someone who's very fond of Buffalo. But that's I think that you're right in the sense that as we think through what we want to happen with education, I would love us to have that kind of conceptual discussion about what paradigm is most appropriate. I will say that I believe that the market pricing paradigm that is used for elite higher education in this country is completely bankrupt. It's absurd when you're paying $80,000 to go to NYU. I mean, that's the failure of a failure of a system right there. So it's a good question. Sure.
What do you think explains the fact that Americans don't resent incredibly wealthy, obscene level of wealth thing that you were talking about? And what are the conditions under which there might be more sanity brought to CEO level, insanity? I'm just curious. You mentioned the tax rate of years past. It's fascinating.
The tax rate thing is so bizarre. So think about it. The top rate, income tax rate through the early 60s, through the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts, and actually through the mid-50s or so, is I think 91% on incomes over $200,000. So that translates, that's roughly $2 million in today's terms. So what they're saying back then was, you can't make more than $2 million. Right? As a society, this country in the mid-50s said, you can't make, in today's dollars, you can't make more than $2 million. Right? And what happened as a result of that? Well, I mean, America went through, first of all, its greatest period of economic growth ever. It was the unquestioned leader in the United States. The social fabric of this country was, with respect to income inequality, fine, right? I mean, you can't point to something that was wrong with America in the 1950s because they said you can't make more than $2 million, right? Now, what's amazing about this is if you even bring this up now, people don't even believe you that that was in place 50 years ago. Adam Goppigan at The New Yorker did this sort of town hall thing in so disastrous. Adam and I, so every now and again we do these things where we did it at the 92nd Street Y, right? We get on stage and we like yap about stuff. Now, we're used to the 92nd Street Y, which is, all of you know what that audience is, right? I'm sure it's a lot like the audience here. So at the 92nd Street Y, you can talk about how taxes in 1950 were 90%, and you can talk about whether that was, what that meant and blah, blah, blah. So we were invited to do a similar kind of thing in Naples, Florida. I did not know that Naples, Florida, I thought Naples, Florida was a kind of extension of the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side. How wrong I was. So here we are up on stage, me and Adam. We forget that, it's like, and we bring this up and people started hissing. I mean, we practically hurled their kind of dinner buns at us. I mean, it was like, and we was like, wait a minute, we didn't make this up. This happened. Here was a room full of kind of Republican retired millionaires, right?
Yeah.
Their parents paid that kind of tax rate. And maybe they were upset about it, but they didn't form a tea party and jump up and down about how they were being turned into socialists. They understood that their country had given them and had made an enormous contribution to them, had made it possible for them to succeed. They also understood that their country had incurred certain obligations that had to be paid for, and that as the wealthiest people in the country, they were the ones best positioned to help pay for that. And by the way, $2 million is a lot of money, right? You can actually live a nice life on $2 million, right? It's only today that we have completely abandoned all sense of proportion. And, people like, this is the most extraordinary quote. It was from Stephen Schwarzman, the private equity. Who remembers this? This is a guy who made about, $1 billion last year. And remember, and my accountant is here, he can correct me if I'm wrong. Don, correct me if I'm wrong. Stephen Schwarzman pays capital gains on his money because he says the money he takes out of his investment pool is capital gains and not income, so he pays 15% and not 40%, right? When there was some move in Congress to raise that, to make him pay normal taxes, right? Remember, he compared it either to Kristallnacht or the Nazi invasion of Poland, which is, by the way, the most obscene thing ever to come out of anyone on Wall Street's mouth in the last 10 years. And by the way, the bar is really high for most obscene thing, right? That is how, when people are saying that with a straight face, you realize that we're completely off the rails. Right? I feel like I want to put him in a time machine, move him back to 1955, and sit down with him as he files his tax return. I think that would just be, I would pay $1 billion for that privilege. Sure.
So how did Miller connect with the baseball union? I mean, from your talk, it seemed like the players were I don't know if happy, but were okay with the situation, and kind of like Miller came in and opened their eyes. But how did he actually get to that position?
Job.
Was there aggrieved players who asked him? Did he apply?
It's a great story. So Miller he's this senior guy at Steelworkers, and he's very well respected in the union movement, in the labor movement. And the players are shopping. Players understand that they have a problem, but they're concerned about very, very narrowly with their pension. They think the owners are trying to screw them on the pension. And they understand that as presently whatever, they don't trust them, they don't think they have the organization necessary to protect their pensions. They're looking for new leadership. And there's a guy called Cannon, who is basically he's the owner's person, he's the owner's stooge. And the owners are trying to push Cannon on the players. And a couple of them, I've forgotten the names, but some of the most sort of interesting players of that era, smarter players of that, have become suspicious of Cannon and start looking for outside candidates. Interestingly enough, the first outside name they come up with is Richard Nixon. And when they first approach, and then they think, oh, no, maybe Richard Nixon would be better as the general counsel of the Players Union. Because remember, this is 1966. He's practicing at Mudge Rose on Wall Street. He's not yet run for president. So they go to Miller, if you can imagine. They go to Miller and they say, we would like you to be the head of the Players Union, and we'd like your general counsel to be Richard Nixon. Now, from what I've told you about Marvin Miller, you can guess his feelings about Richard Nixon, right? They're not warm and fuzzy. So he said to them very, very flatly, that's not going to happen, right? You can either have me or you can have Nixon, but... So they were, but there was a kind of, they had no idea what they were getting into. They were simply thinking about pension. They hadn't made the kind of leap. This is incredibly serendipitous from their standpoint. This incredibly serendipitous hire. Sure.
I think one of the people behind it was Jim Bunning, who's now
Yes,
a
that's
senator
right.
from Kentucky,
That's right.
Republican.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't know if you ever asked Miller this, but what does Miller think about the world that he kind of helped usher in the changes? Because it seems like the rise of his baseball union roughly parallels the collapse of his steelworker union and all that movement.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, we had a very long conversation, and I don't know whether I see him in a curious way. I see him as being a much more important figure than I think he sees himself. Mm-hmm. I think he sees himself as doing what any union man would have done in that situation. And I think he thinks all he did was apply the principles that have been worked out over the previous 50 years in the trade union movement to a new field. There is something incredibly kind of self-effacing in his understanding of his role. So when I kind of pressed him to kind of connect what he was doing in baseball to the larger world around him, he was reluctant to make that connection for that reason, I think. And if you read his book, which by the way it's such a great book. I mean, it is a marvelous history of that era. He doesn't go that. He simply confines himself to the story of the players, and he saw himself as, his job was to get the biggest bite out of capital on behalf of his members. That's what you do if you're a union man, right? I don't think he ever kind of goes beyond. But one last question, and then I will. You're the last.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for all your books. They're really transformational and brilliant, and I've really enjoyed all of them.
Thank you.
The question is totally unrelated to your topic today, and I don't have to ask if it's going to shift the whole. Then I have your permission.
It'll be an appropriate closing note.
Okay. Well, it's about your observations in Blink.
Uh-huh.
And you observed in your afterword how the advent of everything that is thrown at us through the internet and all the information that is thrown at us now, how that inhibits our ability to quickly make decisions, and you can articulate it much better than I am sure, but probably I'm sure everybody knows the premise of Blink. My question to you is, how can we, as educators of children who are immersed in this lifestyle now, it's a way of life, how can we teach them and remind ourselves, as a matter of fact, how to rely on those instincts?
Yeah. How do you turn off the? I don't know. I mean, if I had an answer to that, I wouldn't be here, would I? I'd be in some position of great authority and power. But I mean, I suppose the answer is, can we create for people places of cognitive refuge? In other words, are there places we can create for people where they can go and have time for sort of reflection and process the enormous amount of information they have accumulated? I mean, that's for every moment you spend gathering information, I think you ought to spend at least 2 moments making sense of it. And in a perfectly kind of ordered life, those two things are in balance. I think you're right. They've gotten a little bit unbalanced. And so maybe sort of on an institutional level, whether that means taking teenagers and, incarcerating them for short periods of time. I'm kidding. But no, it's very interesting. I'll end on this note. This is my favorite random fact from studies of high achievers. There was a wonderful study done years ago that looked at a whole range of very, very, very creative people and discovered that they're trying to figure out what do they have in common. The answer is almost nothing. But the one thing they all had in common, many of them, was that an extraordinary number of them were bedridden with a serious illness during childhood, late childhood or early adolescence. And, this is sort of, you can say it's a coincidence, it means nothing. Or you can say they were forced into a period of extended reflection. Right? And when you are someone who has the capacity to be enormously creative, if you have been taking in lots of information for a long time, and then you're forced to go off in some sensorily deprived environment for an extended period of time, maybe something wonderful comes out of that. Of course, the first thing I did when I read that is I tried to think back, and was I ever? And of course, the answer is no. But I'm hoping that at some point I will suffer a debilitating illness that will transfer me to the next level. But thank you. Bye-bye.